You've probably heard plenty about the Middle Ages' valiant knights in shining armour, impregnable castles, and the ominous prophecies of the church. But have you ever heard about their bedroom business? Trust me, it was every bit as bizarre and fascinating. Beneath the gleaming suits of armour and the echoing prayers lurked secrets of the bedchamber that even today would make you blush, giggle, or shudder. People back then said everything was under God's watchful eye, even love and desire. Yet no matter how hard they tried, they could never fully extinguish the flame of human longing. There were rules, there were taboos, but there were also secret detours, moonlit nights, and even primitive methods of contraception you'd never imagine. It all started with the unwavering stance of the church. Sex was only for married couples and only for procreation. Yes, having fun didn't make the cut. If anyone dared to find any pleasure in it, they'd have to whisper to themselves, "Oh Lord, I have sinned." Why? Because the church believed that pleasure was the gateway to the devil. It would corrupt the soul distance a person from God and turn the marriage bed into a battlefield of sin. And this wasn't just moral advice, it was carved in stone as law, as absolute prohibition. Every couple had to memorize the holy calendar as if they were cramming for final exams. Sundays, holy day off limits. Thursdays and Fridays, days to remember Christ's suffering off limits. Advent and Lent, long seasons of self-restraint off limits. When you added it all up, nearly half the year was crossed off the list of nights of passion. It might sound a bit ridiculous, but back then this was serious business. They truly believed that fooling around on a forbidden night wouldn't just anger God, it would bring misfortune to the entire family, even the entire parish. Bedroom matters became community matters. If a couple slipped up on a sacred day, they risked being dragged in front of the congregation, bombarded by scornful looks and biting whispers. They don't fear God, they'll drag us all down with them. You think that sounds like a sports match with a referee calling fouls? You're not wrong, but the referees here were the priests in the church, and they didn't stop at handing out red cards. They threatened the souls of the offenders with damnation, or if they were lucky, a lifetime of penance and confessions. After hearing all that, who wouldn't lie awake at night clutching the blanket wondering, should I or shouldn't I? These rules didn't care if you were rich or poor. Peasants and powerful lords alike had to follow them. Even in grand castles lined with velvet and brimming with wine, there were no exceptions. The servants slept just outside the master's door like spies of the faith. They might not have been eavesdropping on purpose, but their ears were sharp enough to catch any hint that the master might have slipped outside the bounds of church law. And what about the common folk? There were no private rooms or thick stone walls for them. One bed for the entire family. Children curled up next to parents, grandparents snoring a few feet away. No concept of privacy at all. A husband or wife had to glance around nervously before even thinking about it, like sneaking potatoes from a neighbour's garden. A single misplaced sigh could be enough to set off a wave of suspicion. Back then, privacy was a luxury few could afford. But let's be real, who can always hold back? There came a night for everyone when a glance, a brush of the hand made hearts pound faster. And that's when the church's calendar felt like an endless debt ledger. So the people learned to innovate. When they couldn't celebrate indoors, they stole away to hedgerows, tree trunks, even cemetery corners. Some joked God must be busy blessing the churches, surely he doesn't bother with what happens under the moonlight in the fields. It sounds amusing, but under the laughter was a current of real fear. Because the church didn't just talk big, they backed it up with fiery sermons and chilling tales. They warned that sex on forbidden nights could result in monstrous children, bulging eyes horns sprouting from their foreheads, as if God was so angry he'd get creative with punishments. Who wouldn't think twice after hearing that? That's why sex back then was like a moral exam. No scorecards but one mistake, and your name might as well be nailed to the church door come Sunday. And once gossip spread, no one would look at you the same again. There was another layer to it too. The church didn't just police actions, it policed thoughts. Even a fleeting fantasy was enough to brand you a sinner. Just lying there, letting your mind wander a bit, could land you in spiritual trouble. It was as if there was a divine security camera in your head, and the manufacturer was God himself. Yet in the midst of all these suffocating rules, people still found a way to breathe, even if it was just a shallow breath. Because despite all the sermons, they still cherished those quiet nights, when the church bells fell silent, and they could reach for each other and forget every word of the priest's warnings. In the end, sex in the Middle Ages wasn't some romantic ballad. It was a sacred contract signed in fear, belief, and a dash of defiance. Under the flickering candlelight they still touched, still trembled with desire, but always with one wary glance at the ceiling where they believed God was watching, or at least where they imagined he was. And you know what? Centuries later that story still lingers, a testament that no rule, no threat can ever kill human longing. It only forces that longing to become wily and a little braver. When the church cracked down on bedroom affairs, the bold took it outdoors. When the church imposed strict prohibitions on bedroom activities, the daring sought alternative venues. Yes, they moved too. The great outdoors. Can you imagine? In the midst of a desolate field, under the pale moonlight casting a silvery glow on the earth, lovers whispered amidst the bushes. There the winds howl through ancient rooftops couldn't drown out the pounding of their hearts. They believed, or at least hoped, that God was preoccupied with grander matters and wouldn't notice the nocturnal escapades in the fields. But it wasn't just the fields. Cemeteries where the living mingled with the dead also became spots for romantic encounters. A bit eerie perhaps, but their logic was straightforward. The dead are silent and the living must live. Who would have thought that a cold grave corner could become the warmest place for yearning nights? Perhaps not as poetic as in literature, but amidst a world of dogma, these were moments of genuine living. Even daylight didn't deter the audacious. In churches devoid of priests, footsteps echoed through the nave like sacred vows. Some lovers sneaked onto old pews, believing that in such hallowed spaces curses would momentarily slumber. It might sound insane, but even more astonishing were tales of kings and queens performing publicly, not out of exhibitionism, but for the throne. When doubts arose about a prince's lineage, monarchs were willing to demonstrate before the court a declaration, "The royal bloodline is genuine." Today it sounds like a jest, but back then it was state policy. Regardless of the setting, secretive or overt, the unchanging truth was that human instincts always sought escape from the church's grip. Yet outdoor trysts weren't without risks. Diseases lurked, and no one wanted their team to suddenly gain unexpected members. Thus, medieval folks were as inventive as any. They devised, or rather concocted, classic contraceptive methods that might make you shudder. Condoms then weren't made of latex, they were crafted from animal bladders, intestines or linen. Imagine a coarse raincoat reused multiple times, washed repeatedly like work clothes. Their scent was likely far from alluring, but at least they reduced risks. Naturally, the church didn't endorse such practices. They viewed contraception as an affront to faith, a rebellion against God's will. To console themselves, they preached that every flow was part of a divine plan. Blocking it was akin to closing heaven's gates. Frightening, yes, but medieval people had their reasoning. God may be wrathful, but diseases show no mercy. So under the dim glow of candles, someone might stealthily retrieve a crude protection from beneath the pillow, not for jest, but for self-preservation. They understood that even if deemed sinful, it was better to err against the church than to contract a severe illness or have an unplanned child. Think this was only the plight of the poor. Think again, nobles didn't want their castles turning into kindergartens. Despite their luxurious surroundings, they feared disease more than the church's sermons. So don't be surprised to learn that even in a queen's wardrobe there might be an odd piece of linen, a talisman for those long winter nights. Yet above all, the church's admonitions echoed, contraception is sinful. Anything that hinders life is an insult to God. These sermons resonated from pulpits to marketplaces, ringing in every believer's ears. But come nightfall, when the wind howled through windows and forbidden tales became whispers under blankets, people still sought compromises with themselves and with God. Though the medieval church endeavoured to preach chastity as the highest virtue, many met tragic ends either by adhering too strictly or by forgetting the rules altogether. Tales of these bizarre deaths weren't just tavern gossip, but served as bittersweet lessons for the era. Let's begin with those who didn't know when to stop, individuals who believed sex was the fountain of vitality, draining themselves to the last drop. John of Gaunt, the illustrious 14th century duke, was a vivid example, or rather once was. Contemporaries recounted his relentless indulgence in love, leading to his body decaying from within in his final days. Some jested that his fluids had staged a protest demanding a break. Chilling, isn't it? But don't pity him just yet. John of Gaunt wasn't alone. Count Ralph of Vermandoise left behind an unforgettable anecdote. This French noble married thrice. Whether driven by desire or the ambition to produce heirs, he continued his campaigns ignoring medical advice. When gravely ill, his doctor sternly warned, "You must abstain entirely." But Ralph turned a deaf ear. The physician didn't need miracles. A mere sniff of his urine revealed, "You're still not resting." He coldly concluded, "In 3 days prepare for departure." Ironically, 3 days later Ralph indeed departed, leaving behind perhaps the most comical funeral in history, where whispers abounded, "Died from love, love to death." Contrasting the overindulgent were the abstinent, those who viewed chastity as spiritual armour, not anticipating that this armour might strangle them. King Louis V of France exemplified this. During the Albigensian Crusade he resolutely remained faithful to his wife, refusing any other contact. Noble, yes, but the outcome was far from glorious. Folktales whispered that it was his excessive purity that led to his downfall. People murmured, he died because he kept himself too well. It was a true medieval tragedy. Some died from too much indulgence, others from too much restraint. People watched, not sure whether to fear the demon of lust or the edicts of the church more. And it wasn't just men. Women of that time weren't spared from this tangled web of bodily fluids. The physicians of the day insisted that just like men, women had their own seed, and if it wasn't released it would build up and make the womb angry. The symptoms sounded like something out of a ghost story: fainting, shortness of breath, a greyish face. Folk humour called it the womb staging a protest. They believed that if it wasn't released for too long, women could die silently, just like men, only more quietly. So alongside all the talk of saving men through moderation, women also had to find ways to make peace with their bodies. A puzzle with no solution that could ever satisfy the church. All these stories, tragic as they were retold by medieval folk with a kind of wry, dark humour. In dimly lit taverns, people gossiped about these near-death experiences with quiet laughter, as if they were sweat-soaked fairy tales. Everyone knew they were real, and also reminders: don't think that bedroom matters were just private affairs. In medieval times, they were a strange balancing act between the church and instinct, between life force and sin. So you see, intimacy in the Middle Ages wasn't just about the mission to reproduce, it was a chess game of life and death. On one side, the church raised the sword of morality, on the other, the human body howled to be satisfied. And in the middle, anyone who miscalculated, whether by going too far or holding back too much, could become one of those near-death cases whispered about for generations. You see, even something as simple as going to bed could turn into a lifelong tragedy. And who knows, on those long medieval nights, how many people lay there hand in hand, eyes locked quietly, wondering, tonight will we live one more day or die in one more story? In the end, after all the sermons, the secret nights, and the unforgettable near-death cases, the bedroom life of medieval people was still a picture full of contradictions. Beneath the vaulted stone ceilings of the church where prayer echoed, people never stopped trying to hold on to those small human comforts. Amid endless bans, there were still stolen glances, shadowy hedges, and rough animal bladder armour, proof that the urge to live never quite gave up. Even though the church tried to turn sex into a joyless duty in every hidden corner of the night, there were still quiet giggles, hidden sighs. People weren't saints. They could bow before the altar, but they would still tiptoe to find an escape for their instincts. And perhaps it was this stubbornness that saved them from becoming living statues trapped in a cage of dogma. These near-death cases, they sounded like dark jokes, but they were stories that couldn't be ignored. John of Gaunt Count, Ralph King Louis VIII, each one a story, each one a reminder that both excess and caution come with a price. The Middle Ages may have ended long ago, but that haunting question, how to live without regret, still has no answer. Isn't it funny how even just the question of bedroom matters could turn a whole society upside down? And yet medieval folk always found a way to sneak around it, from graveyards to abandoned bell towers. At night, when God was perhaps busy with bigger things, they would still find a way to slip into each other's arms, even if only for a brief stolen moment. Some say today's world is completely different. We're freer now, no longer trembling at midnight bells or priests' whispers. But be honest, somewhere deep down there are still those invisible rules, those moral codes that make us freeze when we're having too much fun. These medieval tales aren't just ancient history. They're satirical mirrors of ourselves, humans forever juggling instinct and virtue, laughter and fear. So yes, bedroom life in the Middle Ages. It wasn't just a private matter for two. It was a game of wits, a dark comedy where people feared, laughed and snuck around. You might chuckle, you might frown. But in the end, what remains is this simple truth. People have always known how to find a way, even when God is watching, even when the church is scolding. And maybe that's the most enduring story of the Middle Ages and of every age, no matter how tightly society tries to bind us. There's always room for a stolen hug, a secret kiss, and a belief that living means never letting your instincts be buried.